what we've talked about is how you get in, how you apply, how do you decide which programs you might want? How do you apply to them? What are they looking for? What are some important things to consider and plan for? What happens if you do all of that and you don't get accepted? And it's can feel really bad when you're sitting there and you've applied to, you've followed all the guidelines, you've applied to a dozen places, and that puts you in a relatively good place in terms of numbers. You think, I didn't have all 3 9s and 165 on the GRE for verbal and 165 on the quantitative. I didn't have all that, but I had pretty good stuff. Well, that unfortunately happens sometimes. There's a lot of factors that go into it, and some of them are within your control, which is what we've talked about, and some of them are not. So here's what I suggest doing. One is check usually late in the semester, like in April or so. So that's late in the spring semester, because you're going to be getting in typically in the fall semester is the most common one. Others have some rotating entrance times, but most of them are that. So check in that to see if all the spots have filled. Every once in a while, the spots will have filled, but somebody will have dropped out. And so there's nothing wrong with giving a call to the program and say, hey, listen, I'm really interested in your program. And I wanted to check to see, if all of the spots have been filled. And again, some programs will go, well, if they're not filled, we don't care. We're not going to fill them. They either got filled with our first choices or that's it. But some of them will go back and take a look at it. Don't count on this, but it is a possibility. Okay. Next is do, an application autopsy, meaning you're going to go back at the whole application, you're going to look through everything, and you're going to try to determine what's going on. Where are the weaknesses within this? Okay. As a general rule, I do not suggest calling the places or emailing the places that you applied to and say, why didn't you let me in? Usually they're not going to tell you. They don't want to sit down. They don't want to make you feel bad. They also may not know exactly why, because you may be just one of a group of them and they may have just cut you at some point. That maybe that they did really consider you and they don't really want to make you feel bad. Seldom do they tell you anything. They'll say things like this: we had a lot of great applicants. It'll be a standard kind of a platitude that they give you about that. It's too uncomfortable to tell people and to kind of go through and say, well, this is what you didn't have and this is what you did. If you know somebody there, you're good friends with somebody there, or you have a connection there somewhere, you might be able to get that feedback, but usually not. Usually people, it's kind of, they cringe at that idea. You'll get some people who will tell you, oh no, I'm okay. I'm more than glad to talk to people about it, but that's rare. And one of the problems is if you have some reason that isn't super well spelled out, it's just kind of a feeling that this person was better than this person, and you only had those spots, it's hard to explain. So as a general rule, they don't. You go back and look at the weaknesses of your application yourself. Go have somebody look at it, have a professor look at it at your undergraduate program, have colleagues look at it, have friends look at it and say, what are you thinking about this? Just to get a sense of, how it looks, how it sounds. Do you have a lot of information? A good guess is if it's not too low a GPA, and if it was a place that needed a GRE and the GRE wasn't too low, then it was likely to be due to things like experience, lack of research experience, lack of clinical experience. So did you make the first cut? GPA and or GRE. So those rank lower in importance, but that's only on the back end. They rank lower of importance. That means I've already collected, I've got my final 50 to 100 people I'm going to review. Everybody else I've gotten rid of. Okay. Once I get to that, they don't make a whole lot of difference because they're all likely to be pretty good, in the 3.6, 3.7, it doesn't make as much difference at that point. It may be a deciding point when we get down to the nitty gritty, and I've got one more spot and I've got 2 people and they look really great and they're equal. One has a 3.7 overall, one has a 3.6. We'll go with the 3.7. So those can be deciders at that point. They were important up front to do the cuts. On the back end, less important than that. And you can't change that in many cases, right? You've got your 3.6. That's what you have. And you can't make a change at that point. You've already finished your undergraduate career in many cases at this point, because you've applied typically in the fall of your senior year. So, you're finished up in the spring, getting ready to go to graduate school that following fall. And you can't do much to your GPA at that moment, but you can go back and look at, other things. Maybe your letters were not great. You won't have seen your letters, but maybe you realize, well, maybe there's somebody else I could choose who would be a better person to write a letter. Or maybe you go back through and notice that, your personal statement was really not well done. Or you notice, oh, I had some errors in it when I was writing it. I had some spelling errors, and there's little things like that that can go, wait a minute, they've got some grammatical errors here. They've got some spelling errors here. And sometimes those are small things that can make the decision or, against you when you're doing those final comparisons. Now, another thing you can do is expand your search. Do a wider range of programs. It may be possible that it's too late for that year, so you have to do it the following year. But think about it. Maybe you were only looking within, one city, or you were only looking within one state, or maybe across, 2 states, but they're all generally within a geographic region. And you've limited yourself. As you go further away, of course, you become someone who is more diverse, in the sense that if a school in, Kansas is looking for, somebody who has different kinds of training, they may be interested in somebody who's coming from, Georgia and South Carolina. So different training models, different, all these kind of things. So that becomes a good thing to do versus taking somebody who is right there in the state. And these things can make a difference sometimes. So expand your search as much as possible. If you apply to a doctoral program, consider applying to a master's program. My recommendation is that using master's programs as a backup for your doctoral program. And since the doctoral programs we're talking about here really, as opposed to the MDs, we're going to set that aside for a little bit. Looking at the PhD in clinical and counseling psychology, you'd be looking at a master's in psychology. There are terminal master's degrees in psychology that you finish out your degree, and that is considered it. But since there's no direct licensure in many places, I mentioned that, for example, in Texas, we have a licensed psychological associate. So it's possible to get that after the master's. But in most places, that's not the case, right? Unless you have a master's in counseling, which leads you to an LPC. But the master's in psychology does not lead to direct licensing. What it really does is you're applying to that program because it will help you develop some skills. It will help you develop your GPA, those kinds of things. So, for example, you didn't have a good enough GPA, didn't have good enough GRE, didn't have good enough clinical experience, didn't have good enough research experience, didn't have any publications, whatever it is. By going to the master's program, it'll be easier to get into than the doctoral program. And you then can get your master's in psychology, and it will give you a number of different things. It will give you the opportunity to get your GPA up, for example. It'll give you the opportunity to get research experience or clinical experience, depending upon where you go. Then you apply to the doctoral program. Now, remember, originally for the doctoral program, you typically apply directly to the doctoral program after your undergraduate degree. However, this master's is the going back around. You typically are going to lose at least a year. Master's program will be 2 years, but what will happen is the doctoral program likely will only accept a small number of those, either the class credits, or they may not accept the thesis that you did. So there's something in there that they may not. So plan on losing about a year. This adds extra time because it's not just like you've got your master's, then you're already a couple of years into the PhD. It doesn't work that way. So, but it's a way to, give yourself that opportunity to get in if your grades weren't good enough or your experience wasn't good enough and you needed more research or whatever. So that's why if you apply to a doctoral program, consider a master's program. And I usually recommend going ahead and applying to a couple of master's programs while you're applying to the doctoral programs. And there are a couple of really good master's programs in psychology that have a track record of getting people into doctoral programs afterwards. So that's another route. Again, it's not the most direct route, but it is a route for your PhD. Obviously, if you're going for a master's degree already in social work, counseling, or marriage and family, that's not what you do in this case. Because there's no other place to apply, you will then have to look for a wider range or do something else about grades and or experience. Okay. Another one is take a gap year or two to do more research and clinical experience. And what do you do in that case? Well, you can do a lot of things. One of the things that you can do is get a research assistant job. A lot of universities, including your undergraduate university, may have jobs within the labs that you had been a practicum student at before. You'd been doing that maybe as a course or working in a lab as a volunteer or whatever. They often have some, especially for people who have already done that at the undergraduate level and they, didn't get into graduate school. That can become a great way of getting experience. And oftentimes the professors are happy to have you on as a paid research assistant because you've already been through, they've already trained you how to do that. Now you can begin doing the training of other people at an undergraduate level who are getting experience. You can also get more clinical experience, work for, perhaps a nonprofit and intake services, or do those kind of things that you're allowed to do even without a license to get that experience. So what that does is it doesn't change your GPA at all, but it gives you a lot more clinical or research experience. And that extra year or so can make all the difference in the world. If you didn't get into a program at all, you're going to have to wait a year anyway, because you can't apply again unless it's a floating, entrance time, but most of them are not. You're going to have to wait a year. So do something during that year and do something directly related to the graduate program. And there's not just any job. You don't want to take a job as a clerk at a hotel or a server at a restaurant. Those are fine jobs, but that's not going to help you during that gap year in terms of filling in your application or you're making your resume stronger. Okay. Just get a job. That is in that area. So this gap year to gain more research or clinical experience, sometimes you can just get a job, do that job for a while. The research or clinical experience I stated here is really geared specifically. You're going to be there for 1 or 2 years and then go. In this case, get a job that doesn't require licensure. It's in the general field. See if you like the field or not. Is that where you want to stay or not? So in that case, it's not directly getting experience just so you can reapply in a year. It's more, let me get a job. Let me see if I'm liking this field or not. And do I want to spend the extra time? And if you do, then the job becomes good experience going forward. And then the last thing I've suggest here, and this is one nobody really wants to hear, it's seek out another career. Is it possible you won't be able to do one of these careers? It's possible. It's possible your grades won't be good enough. It's possible that, you won't have enough experience and you decide at some point, well, you could go back and get more undergraduate training, and increase your GPA. That's possible. You could always do that. Add another undergraduate degree, but that's a lot of extra time. If you want to do it, great. But it may be that that's too time consuming. It may be, for example, that that gap year is just too much. It's you don't have the capabilities of doing it. In those cases, you may have to seek out another career. It happens regularly. I've seen people do it. I've seen people seek another career and then along the way come back and get other training and then get retrained later on. So there are options that are possible, but the facts are there are times when people don't get into these graduate programs and there's just, the grades are too low or the experience isn't there. And even when you go out to get it, it's not enough in those cases unless you get in certain situations. So that's not one anyone wants to hear, but it may be the best option in some cases. It's like this one is not going to be there for me, or if it was, it's going to be 4 years down the line, and that may be too far down the line to make it viable for you for what you want to do. And you may have other interests too. This was a great interest, but you may have other things that also would be great for you to do. And most of you all have a lot of different skills. It's not just this one skill, and a lot of different interests, and those may be more fruitful for you in the end.